Gone, but not forgotten. It's hard to describe the strong ties between the coal branchers. It's a fact that we lived in a musician's and a sportsman's paradise, but enjoying a relatively secure existence during a pressed time in our history, I have to believe our connection was enforced by our isolation from the rest of the country. We inhabitants of the mining camps had to rely on each other in every circumstance. Together, we experienced our moments of distress and misery, as well as our moments of victory and joy. Family and friends would often talk about past events that I was too young to remember. I recall many of the mishaps, unusual occurrences, and special events they discussed. A newspaper article came out called "The God of the Mountains Strikes Again." Yes, he did. Again and again and again. The first fatality in the Catamount mine occurred on June 12, 1918. The coal caved in on a 23-year-old named Philip Sharamata while he was doing some timbering. This bit of history I picked up while reading Underground at Mountain Park by Bill Davies. 21st of December the same year, John Lukelin, at 29 years of age, was gassed. A. Chompson lost his life in May of 1919, the result of a fall underground. On October 27, 1923, Dan McNeil was a delegate from the Catamount at a miners' convention in Calgary. While walking down the street with B.M. Christophers, MLA for Rocky Mountain House, and Mr. McGuire, another delegate, Dan threw himself under a streetcar on 8th Avenue East. He was crushed between the front bumper and the track. He was 35 years of age and survived by a wife in Catamount. Jay Barron was suffocated on June 15, 1926. In December of 1928, a timber packer boss named Matt Hall was crushed by a falling timber. During the last month of 28, the company started to sink what would become the main shaft and the air shaft. Mr. Werner Jacobson lost his life while working on this endeavor when he was hit by a falling bucket. Over halfway through 1929, Mr. Tom Mulligan was killed in one of the shafts. Charlie Jacoby Sr., a Catamount resident, lost a brother in a caging accident in the Maritimes. This launched him on a crusade to find or develop a safety device that would prevent similar accidents from occurring. He succeeded in inventing and patenting such a device. The design was a system of wedges on both sides of the cage. When there was tension on the cable, the wedges remained up, but if the tension was lost, the wedges would swing down into the guide timber, stopping the fall. August of 1929, my brother Bill Owen was in an explosion and was buried up to his neck. A number of timber pickers were burnt. Bill still has tattoo marks on his face from the coal dust that was driven in. Ed Madams explained the accident this way. A large slab of rock had fallen down onto the battery, and they couldn't move it or break it up. They decided to get the fire boss, Jock Williamson, to set off a charge to break up the rock. Though Jock must have tested for gas, for some unknown reason, when he attached the charge and set it off, a gas explosion still occurred. Bill told me Jock's hair turned white overnight. In November of the same year, another explosion took the lives of R. McGrath and Jay Stewart and burned a number of others. April of 1930, just before I was born, Terry McGuire, a friend of Dad's, was gassed. Not quite a year later, on March 31st, Nick Plexon was gassed. Catamount had one of the most dangerous mines in America. There were times when miners could not go to work because the mine was gassed out. The most feared gas in the mine was fire damp, which originally referred to the gas methane, but was later modified to mean an explosive mixture of air and methane. Methane rarely occurs in pure form as it contains small amounts of ethane, ethylene, nitrogen, and other gases. White damp was originally known as carbon oxide and later as carbon monoxide. Today, we're more familiar with this tasteless, odorless, colorless, poisonous gas than we are with methane. When carbon monoxide is combined with the right amount of air and ignited, it will explode. Carbonic acid gas was known as black damp and also referred to as choke damp, and it's now called carbon dioxide. Enrico Caretti, on June 11, 1931, died of an accidental asphyxiation. He was buried by a cave-in. March 1st, 1933, L. Olson, aged 27 years, lost his life when his legs were run over by a boxcar. His legs were amputated at the Catamount Hospital, but to no avail. This left Jessie Olson McLeod, a widow with two boys, Harold and Gordon. Later, she became Jessie Klein, and a daughter, Barbara, was born to her. She experienced more bad luck when her son Gordon contracted trench mouth, a bacterial infection of the mucous membranes and gums, causing acute ulceration and the loss of teeth. Later, they moved to Vancouver, where Gordon, still a young man, accidentally choked to death. On April 25, 1934, a cave-in took the life of A. Transky, who had just reached the age of 61. On October 7, 1935, Alfred Keene, 21 years old, and the younger brother of Walter and Bill Keene, was fatally injured working on the haulage while driving a spike team. While moving a trip of coal, he attempted to sprag the trip to slow it down. He must have jumped off at a bad spot because he was rolled in with the timbers, breaking his neck. The list of the lost goes on with Ernie Wilson, whose widow Jean eventually married Grant Bowman and worked in the tipple. In 1937, George Stocks lost his life in a cave-in. Domenico Spinozzi, his partner at the time, tried desperately to pull him out, but he was unable to do so, and the gas killed him. The incident left Domenico feeling very bad. Little did he know that less than 3 years later he would lose his life in the same mine. In the annual WCB, or Department of Mines reports, you'll find the statistics, but to family and friends they were much more than just numbers. They were husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers. They were partners on defense and hockey, or at first, second, or third instrument in the band. They were the ones who taught you to drive a nail, shoot a puck, or catch a fish. They watched over you when you were new on the job. They cared about you and your family. Every loss left a vacuum and a period of mourning. It was heartrending to hear some of the wives calling out for loved ones. "Carl, my Carl, oh come out, my Carl," or "Joe, where are you, Joe? Joe, oh Joe." The fact that some of these wives were far from their native homelands and had a poor grasp on the English language made their situations more desperate. It was at times like this you had the community's support. The union representatives would assist with workmen's compensation. The Legion would look into pension eligibility if it was a veteran's widow. There would be family and friends to surround you. You weren't alone. The war was declared in 1939, and the mine went into full production, as did mine disasters. On December 30th, 1939, the last shift of the year, a bump took the lives of 3 miners: James Madams, 29 years, John Burnside, 41 years, and Domenico Spinozzi, 49 years. One particularly sad aspect of this disaster was that Jimmy Madams, having reached safety, realized his partners had not come out and went back in to try and save them. He was overcome by methane and died a hero's death. They say he had a lot of guts, and I agree, but I've never met an underground miner who did not. With the exception of wind, flood, frost, and bumps, the mine was relatively quiet. Then, on March 15th, 1941, James Clyde Lomer lost his life. Jimmy was 19 years old and had been underground for just 10 days. He wanted to earn enough money to buy some new clothes and his rail fare to Edmonton. He planned to join the Air Force. If you volunteered, you could select the service of your choice, but if you were called up, you went into the Army. His job was on the pressure door. As the main and tail trip approached, he would open the door. When the trip went through, he would close it, thus taking the pressure off the second door, allowing it to be opened. The pressure doors were necessary to ventilate the mine. They were set far enough apart to allow the trip to get through the first door and have enough room and time left to open the second door after the first was closed. If the one door was not closed, the air pressure was too great for one man to open the other. For some reason, Jimmy tried to open the door but couldn't. Instead of jumping clear, he kept pulling to no avail. Unfortunately, the oncoming trip drove him through the door. I was only 10 years old when the news reached our home. I witnessed my mother weeping in silence. I'm sure a lot of people wept that day besides his own family. It was on August 6th that a close friend of our family, Harry Lane, lost his life, leaving behind his wife, Gwenny. He was 43 years of age. He'd fallen down the chute. There was kind of a mystery about it. Listening to the adults, it seemed no one could figure out how it happened. A year later, on the 5th of August, 1942, while working afternoon shift in number 9 panel, the pillar broke through into the old workings, which were full of water. The panel flooded, taking the lives of 5 miners: John Wallace, age 40, Vittoria Allegorio, 40 years, Joseph Dombrowski, 51 years, Carl Stock, 53 years, and fire boss John Logan, 60 years. There was no warning of the impending danger, not even wet or coal. Robert Muir and Charles Swanson were another pair who were caught in a bump. Robert Muir, the fire boss on shift, reached safety, but when Charles, who stopped to hide some tools, didn't come out, Robert went back to find him. Neither came out alive. On July the 16th, 1943, Mum had everything packed. Our holidays started in 2 days' time. Wow, 2 weeks on the coast. What excitement! Unfortunately, a knock came at the door in the wee hours of the morning. Jack Smith and Fred Beale were caught in what was called a slough. My dad was a fire boss, but was taking his turn in the pillars. Fred Beale was the fire boss on duty that night. Fred asked Dad to accompany him as he went to go inspect the workings for safety before the miners went back up. A miner never goes alone in the mine except in the main airways. When they were going up to examine the workings, a large amount of coal in the pillar caved, forcing a large amount of the gas down onto the airway on top of them. I was told they tried to bury their faces in coal to avoid the gas, but it was to no avail. The last time I remember the God of the Mountains striking in the mine was June 14th, 1950. We lost fire boss Roy Carr, Peter Morris, Steve Tom Lovanovich, Red Kasanovich, and Mike Kapowski. Like any other camp or village, we had our share of sad times due to tragedies outside the mines. When I was very young, the school had a teacher named Miss Amy Mullins, who was being courted by a teller from the Bank of Nova Scotia. I understand they were not allowed to get married until she'd worked there 5 years. It sounds like the same as the RCMP to me. I didn't know what had happened, but I do know she took her own life, with Lysol of all things. I can't think of anything much worse. Everyone who lived on the coal branch knows of the panic created by George Panic in June of 1936. I've heard a number of different versions. All I know is that in the early morning of that June day, the RCMP sergeant knocked on our door. When Mother answered it, he asked her if she had seen anyone around there that morning, namely George Panic. She replied no, and asked why. He told her he had shot some people downtown, had been seen early that morning going up the path between the rooming house and ours. He suggested we not go into the bush behind our house for that day, and then he left. That did it. Mum wouldn't even let us look out the window. When the men got home from work, we got the sketchy story. It seemed John, Jess, and George had been drinking. They went to John's house and continued with Mrs. Jess joining in. Then the drink was gone, and there was an altercation between Mrs. Jess and George, and she threw him out of the house. He went home, got a gun, and went back in the wee hours of the morning. Upon entering, he went to the bedroom and fired a number of shots, hitting Mrs. Jess in the chest. He didn't harm John or Mary, their little girl. Leaving the Jess house, he went to another house belonging to Bill Lobos. Then he shot Andy Istvan and John Harco, Mrs. Jess's brother. The shootings were not fatal, and all recovered. The only thing that was not recovered was a pure leather club bag. Craig Lee, my cousin, had just sold the bag to George for $12. He'd paid $5 down. Craig went to the RCMP to claim the bag back. He was told he'd have to wait until the case was settled. The case was closed 30 years later in 1966. The RCMP sent a letter to Mr. H. McKenna, who was the magistrate at the time, stating that George's remains were found just off the West Mine Road by berry pickers. All that was found were some bones, the barrel of a gun with a stock gone, and a watch fob with his name on it. A lot of people were sympathetic towards George, as they thought he was ill and used by his circle of friends. Another sad memory was from my brother Bill's girlfriend, Peggy Wells. Peggy spent many hours at our home reading to my brother Donald and I. We would color with crayons and watercolors, and at the same time Peggy would be talking to Mother. They would talk about why Bill was waiting so long to propose marriage, among other things. Peggy had contracted TB, and it was very advanced. They, whoever they were, did not want them to get married, so consequentially, Bill did not propose. Peggy passed away at 21 years of age, and I thought she was one of the prettiest and sweetest girls I'd ever met. Another tragedy was the premature death of Mrs. Passamara, the mother of Joe and Aldo. She required a gallstone operation, which was supposed to have been straightforward. The doctors from Luscar and Mountain Park got together with Dr. Epstein of Catamount. Something went terribly wrong, though, and she passed away during the operation, leaving us in a state of disbelief and despair, and all we could do was wonder why. In 1947, when school was out for the summer, I was hired by Mannix Construction Company. My job was being a grease monkey on the shovel and guiding the trucks in for loading. It was a Bucyrus Erie, a good-sized shovel for its time. When things were slack, I would ride on the inside and clean and polish it. When things were going smoothly, I would load the ukes with rock, and the drivers would let me run them to the dump and back. That's how we young fellows learned to operate heavy machinery. Late in July, on a nice sunny day, we were loading the coal trucks for the coal haul. I'd finished most of the greasing and polishing and was outside guiding coal trucks in. George Paul, a very silent man with small round glasses, was operating the shovel on this day. He had to move the shovel closer to the coal face. The shovel locks in place and would not swing when the machine is moving ahead or backwards. The shovel locks in place and won't swing when the machine is moving ahead or backwards. He just started to move ahead, and when all of a sudden a large amount of rock and mud broke away from the top of the inside wall and crashed down against the side of the shovel, George was crushed to death. One of the drivers and I rushed over to help him. The top of the slide was level with his shoulders. His glasses were off the bridge of his nose, and his hands were still on the levers. It was over in minutes. If he'd not been moving the shovel at that moment, the slide would have spun it around, possibly saving his life. I guess that's what you call fate. Early one morning, one of Bob Spinich's trucks, loaded with timber, was headed towards Mountain Park. That night we had about a 4-inch fall of fresh snow. The next morning the sun was shining brightly. It appeared the driver went snowblind and went over the bank at the Sulphur Springs. His swamped escaper unhurt, but the driver died. I wonder how many people have suffered snow blindness. One afternoon I was walking up over the coal dump on my way to work. There had been a fresh fall of snow that morning, and the sun came out by noon. By the time I got to the top of the coal dump, I was snowblind. I continued towards the shaft, and it would have been okay, except that a pile of rock had recently been dumped on my route. I walked directly into it, injuring my shins and my knees and seriously hurting my elbow. I got up very quickly, hoping no one had seen me. I felt so stupid walking into a rock pile, but everything was white. The outline of the rock pile was impossible to even see after running into it. After managing to get into the bathhouse with no further incidents, I changed into my work clothes, but my fellow miners suggested I go to the hospital, not down to the mine. They said I looked as though I'd come out of a war zone, and believe me, it felt like it too. Another sad occurrence was when Geraldine Beach was burned. In the early days, her mother, Mrs. Beach, and Artie Lou Beach, her dad, separated, and because he wouldn't pay support, the judge awarded Mrs. Beach the barber and beauty shop. Bill Kansky became the barber and Miss Bard the hairdresser. It was while playing around a 45-gallon drum bonfire that she was looking at Life magazines, smoking in the drum. Suddenly, the fire exploded, and through them setting her on fire. The quick work of Margaret Shearer helped put the fire out and to get Mrs. Ferguson, who poured oil over her burns. As the burns were serious and there was concern for her eyesight and scarring, it was very fortunate that there was no noticeable scarring and that she retained her eyesight. There was many other sad moments I heard about or remembered. One was the passing away of Peggy Roberts, who was just 9 years old. Another occurrence was the passing away of Annie Drabowski a few days after falling off the baseball field bleachers while playing monkey crawl. Evelyn Brown was playing with her at the time it happened. Then there was Barbara Stiles, who died at 18 years of age just before her wedding day. The Stiles owned the dairy before Talgo and Moxness. We take antibiotics for granted today, but I remember my family and friends referring to other youth fatalities that didn't need to have occurred had they been available. Marguerite Moldeman, Billy Valence, Marty Steeran, and some more were fatalities. Mary was only 11 years old and passed away on April 11th in the 30s, another victim of a ruptured appendix. I can't document more of these incidents as the people I've contacted have no better memory than I have, or I haven't contacted the right ones. There's no doubt that I've missed some happenings. If so, document them on the last 3 pages of this book, please.